Thank you all very much for coming. We're really happy to see you here. I'm Marcy Darnofsky. I'm the Associate Director at the Center for Genetics and Society, which together with Generations Ahead is co-hosting this event. And we're really excited to hear Dorothy Roberts talk today about her important new book, Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. I've had the pleasure of reading it, and I have to tell you that it's a riveting account about something that is important but distressing. It's about the resurgence of scientific ideas about race as biology, and as importantly, what this means for our commitments to social and racial justice. So I'll introduce Dorothy a bit more fully in a moment, but we wanted to first just take a minute to tell you a little bit about the two host organizations, Generations Ahead and the Center for Genetics and Society. And so we'll lead off with Sujatha Jesudasan, the Executive Director of Generations Ahead. Sujatha.
Good afternoon. So Dorothy Roberts changed my life twice, and I'm not sure I've actually told her the story. The first time is when I read her book, Killing the Black Body. And for many women who are active in women's health issues, we've had the similar experience of we read that book and it really shifted the way we thought about the world, and particularly the intersection of race, gender, and reproduction. And after I read that book, I started getting involved in the reproductive justice movement. And then back in 2004, I heard Dorothy speak again, and it was more explicitly about that intersection of race and genetics. And it was really that moment for me that the light bulb went on of in the new scientific developments and discoveries around race, around genetics, that we were recreating the concept of race as a biological concept again. And as somebody who was very involved in social justice activism, what it made me do was it made me move out of reproductive justice work solely, create an organization, the organization I lead now called Generations Ahead, which really works at building the capacity of social justice advocacy and activist organizations to be involved in these discussions. Oftentimes we think about reproductive genetics as either medical or scientific issues, or we think about genetics in the biomedical context as really a scientific endeavor. And really, Dorothy, I think of as one of the pioneers who has led the way to help us think about truly this is a social justice issue. And so Generations Ahead has really taken the work that Dorothy has done and built an organization around it where we work with activists in racial justice organizations and LGBT organizations and disability rights organizations and reproductive justice organizations and reproductive rights organizations to help them understand the importance of genetics, genetic technology, reproductive genetics, and then how to translate that into activism and advocacy. And that is the work that Generations Ahead continues to do. We really work at the true intersection of race, gender, disability, sexual orientation, and genetics. And that's just a little bit about our organizations. I encourage you to check out our website. It's generations-ahead.org. And it is with great pleasure that I'm here that we're co-hosting this event, and it's been my honor to both work with Dorothy and introduce her. Thank you.
But Dorothy has really been an inspiration to all the people and the organizations that are working in this field, and that is also the case for the Center for Genetics and Society. We're a Berkeley-based organization. We're a nonprofit public affairs group, and we work to encourage socially responsible uses and governance of new human genetic and reproductive technologies. Most of our activities are focused in two areas. One is our media and communications work. We track developments and news about human biotechnologies and comment on the news. We do this through our website Newswire, our blog, our News Weekly, and we invite you to subscribe to that, to also take a look at our website, geneticsandsociety.org. Tarrytown meetings, after the location in New York State where they're held, what we're doing there is bringing together individuals and organizations who share our sense of the need to look at the broader societal and policy issues that are raised by certain of the human biotechnologies, and to do that from a perspective that is grounded in our commitments to social justice, to human rights, to ecological integrity, the common good, and democratic governance. So, those are abstract concepts, and we try to bring them to life in the work that we do and the work that this nascent and growing network of colleagues is doing in many, many different ways. And we encourage you all to find out about it and hopefully to get involved. The Tarrytown Meetings Initiative at this point involves several hundred people, both the majority from the US, but also from other countries where these issues are often grappled with in a much more sophisticated way, and I'm sorry to say, than in the United States. The Tarrytown meeting participants include publicly engaged scholars whose work ranges across a really wide array of disciplines. It's really quite robustly multidisciplinary, which is one of the things that people comment on as being so wonderful about these convenings. So we have participants from humanities, from social sciences, natural sciences, law, medical and scientific professionals, people involved in policy work on the ground, and also advocates from a range of civil society organizations, disability rights, racial justice, progressive religious communities, and others. So one of the CGS staff who will be at the tables afterward, and who you can identify if you can read name tags, the small print on the name tags, we'll be really more than happy to tell you a lot more about what we're doing and the exciting activities and how you might be able to get involved. So a couple of housekeeping. There is cold water in the back, and please do partake of it. The restrooms are outside near the front desk. If you did not register for this event online, we would love it if you would either leave a business card or give us your name and email address so that we can tell you about future events if you haven't done that already. And just about the program, after I introduce Dorothy, she'll talk, and then she will take questions from you. And after that, after that Q&A period, you will be able to buy books at this table over here or in the back, and Dorothy is going to be signing books over here at this table on your right? So I think that's all the housekeeping. Let me say a few words about Dorothy, and then we'll hear from her. Dorothy Roberts is the Kirkland and Ellis Professor at Northwestern University School of Law. She also has joint appointments in the Departments of African American Studies and Sociology, and is a faculty fellow of the Institute for Policy Research. So she's written extensively about the issues that Sujatha mentioned, the interplay of gender, race, and class in legal issues that concern reproduction, bioethics, and child welfare. She's the author of 2 award-winning books. That's 2 so far. That's not even counting what we're going to see in terms of the reception to Fatal Invention. One that Sujatha mentioned, Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, which influenced a lot of us in the reproductive rights community and the social justice community. Her other book is Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, and Fatal Invention, which has just been published this summer by the New Press. So in addition to these books, Dorothy has co-edited 5 casebooks and anthologies. She's published numerous articles and essays in scholarly journals and law reviews and other books. She's been a visiting professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Stanford, Fordham. She's received awards from the National Science Foundation and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, among others. And so those are her academic credentials, and that's not all. Dorothy, in addition to her prolific and influential scholarship, has really been very deeply involved in policy and advocacy work and in public outreach, and in all those areas has had enormous influence. She serves on the Standards Working Group of the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. That's California's Stem Cell Research Institute. And she's also on the boards of directors of several public interest organizations, the Black Women's Health Imperative, the National Coalition for Child Protection Reform, and Generations Ahead. In addition, she's served on the steering committee of the Center for Genetics and Society's Tarrytown meetings. And at the last meeting this past summer, she helped develop and she moderated a panel that was called Race Under the Microscope, Tackling Biological Misunderstandings of Race in Research. So Dorothy speaks frequently at university campuses, for social justice organizations, and other public forums, and she's already been doing a lot of that today. And then tomorrow, she'll be heading down to Los Angeles, where she'll be talking about fatal invention at a couple of events. One is sponsored by Ms. Magazine and the Feminist Majority Foundation, and another sponsored by California Black Women's Health Project. And in my inbox, the email from the California Black Women's Health Project had the subject line, "An Evening with a Living Legend," which was very nice. So I guess the short version of this really is, at least the way I would sum it up, I hope it's okay with you, Dorothy, is that really Dorothy's modeling and exemplifying a role to which I suspect a number of us in this room actually aspire, and that's the role of being a publicly engaged intellectual whose work really matters and makes a difference in the world. And we're just thrilled that she's here with us today. So please welcome her.
Good evening. Thanks so much for coming, and thank you so much, Sujatha and Marcy, for those very generous and gracious and loving and warm introductions. I have been very privileged to be able to work with Marcy and Sujatha and Generations Ahead and Center for Genetics and Society over the years, and that work has influenced my writing, and I couldn't have written and published this book without their support, so I'm very grateful for it. In Fatal Invention, I claim that we are witnessing a new racial politics that is reinventing the political system of race in biological terms using cutting-edge genomic science and biotechnologies. And I argue that this refurbishing of old racial stereotypes in new scientific garb not only distorts the meaning of race and the meaning of humanity, but also helps to obscure racial inequality in America. We know that from 18th century racial typologies to 20th century eugenics, science has always been instrumental in promoting biological races and the view that they really exist innately in human beings. And the new racial science in this century is doing the same thing. But what's new about it is that these scientists claim that they are no longer influenced by politics and racial bias, and that they have found more accurate ways of determining race at the molecular level. Now, this is happening, I argue, at a particularly dangerous moment, because at the very same time that genomic science is, some are saying, that race is important in genetics, critical in genetics, a new ideology that we are in a post-racial America is perpetuating the myth that race is no longer important in society. And it's that convergence that I try to highlight in Fatal Invention and show the dangerous intersection of a new racial science at a time of especially brutal repression, especially of people of color in this country, and yet a time when we're told race no longer matters in society. To give some more details about my argument, I write in the preface to Fatal Invention that this emerging biopolitics of race has three main components. What I just mentioned, the argument that race is a biological category written in our genes, and the claim that new scientific research is discovering proof of this. And then, so that's the first piece of it. The second is that the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries are converting this new racial science into products that are developed and marketed according to race and that incorporate assumptions of racial difference at the genetic level. And then third piece of it is that government policies that are now officially colorblind, because of course the government doesn't pay attention to race anymore, are stripping poor minority communities of basic services, social programs, and economic resources in favor of corporate interests, while at the same time imposing on these very same communities harsh forms of punitive regulation and surveillance. These dehumanizing policies of surveillance and control are then made invisible to many Americans. You know, if you tell many people that there is this kind of brutal repression going on in America, they'd say, that's impossible, not in our fine democracy. And so why is it invisible to so many people? And I argue that this emerging genetic understanding of race that focuses attention on molecular difference and technological cures helps to mask this continued racism and its impact on our society. So again, just to emphasize, it's this convergence of race, science, and politics that I believe is so threatening, that scientists are searching for racial difference at the molecular level precisely as more and more Americans believe that race makes no difference at the social level. Now, about 8 years ago, I first began reading about scientific discoveries that purported to validate the biological reality of race, and I was very surprised. I was naive. I thought that everyone had accepted the view that I learned first from my parents, that there is only one human race, and also the view I learned in college that scientists, and including anthropologists and sociologists and historians and legal scholars, had all shown conclusively that race is a social construct. So it was a little surprising to me. And the more I saw this, the more disturbed I got. And then one pivotal event was a prestigious lecture at Northwestern Medical School, an annual lecture given, the Silverstein Lectures. And they invited a conservative commentator who was well known for arguing that genes determine athletic ability and intelligence. You can guess who got the intelligence and who got the athletic ability, according to him. And he was invited to challenge a well-known geneticist who explained that the human species is not divided into human races. And that is what clued me in. This is being taken seriously. And so I decided to start working on this project because not only did it violate principles I'd learned growing up, but also as a scholar and as an activist, I had devoted my research and work to the injustices, to contesting the injustices that were made possible by an ideology that separates people into different kinds of human beings, which is also an ideology that pretends that social inequities are caused by biological differences. And I think that is a way of thinking about human beings and the way society is organized that we can see extends through history and through a lot of unjust policies that continue to this day. I think a lot of my work has been devoted to pointing out the harmful fallacy of blaming social inequality on biological difference. So I undertook this book project as a personal challenge to my conviction that what we call race is a political system, not an innate division among human beings. After years of intense research and really trying to examine critically my own convictions on this, I did not find a single shred of evidence to counter the political nature of race. In fact, if anything, my journey through the research for this book only strengthened my understanding of our common humanity and the dehumanizing consequences of believing in innate racial differences. Now, you probably know that it was only a little more than a decade ago that the biological concept of race seemed to be finally at its end. In fact, with the unveiling of the Human Genome Project, all the dignitaries on the stage, President Clinton, Craig Venter, and Francis Collins, all made a statement about race because apparently everybody wanted to know, would the Human Genome Project reveal that race really existed at the genetic level, and they all said it didn't, and Bill Clinton famously declared human beings, regardless of race, are 99.9% the same. And this is actually something that had been proven long before the Human Genome Project. Evolutionary biologists and anthropologists for decades have shown that human beings are not divided by race. Biologically, there's only one human race, and race applied to human beings is a political division in the sense that, and I think the only sense that race exists among human beings is it is a system of governing people that classifies them into a social hierarchy based on invented biological and other kinds of demarcations. It's a social grouping that was created to support slavery and colonialism, and its boundary lines have shifted over time to suit political ends. So the reason why the U.S. Census categories and the rules defining race have changed over 20 times since the first census in 1790 isn't because of new advances in science that discovered better ways of categorizing people by race. It's because of political reasons to change. Reports and the hope that people had that the Human Genome Project, if not all the other evidence, would finally put an end to this concept was premature. And in fact, instead of investigating how genes work in human beings, for many scientists, the mission became how do genes work differently in people of different races. There was an opportunity to use genomic science to help to change the way that race has been defined biologically, and instead just the opposite happened in many labs around the country. So let me highlight some of the developments creating the new racial science that I detail in my book. One aspect of it is that some scientists claim that they can discover, using computer-generated gene clusters, a fundamental human structure in a fundamental structure in the human genome that is scientifically determines, apart from society and politics, how human beings are organized biologically. And the studies that have gotten the attention, the headlines, are the ones that claim to verify 5 main human populations, which happen to map onto everyday concepts of race. But these studies depend on the instructions, the genetic samples, the assumptions that are fed into the computer, and so the computer will also find 20 divisions among human beings, or just 2, or however many numbers you feed it to the computer. And so I think what they show is that there are lots of ways we could slice up the vast range of human genetic variation. Then another aspect of this racial science is a continuation of ideas that have been present in medical practice for a long time, which is that you must treat patients according to race. And so myths about racial difference in disease continue and result, I would argue, not in better medical practice, but actually in deadly medical stereotyping in the doctor's office. Studies show that blacks are less likely than whites to receive pain medication, for example, for the same injuries. They wait longer to receive life-saving treatment for a heart attack, and they're more likely to die while awaiting a transplant. Now, some scientists are searching for genes to explain racial disparities in health. Why is it that blacks die at higher rates and younger from hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, asthma, certain cancers? Some scientists argue, well, it's because of genetic difference. And so a lot of money and effort is going into either looking for the genes that explain these differences or a more sloppy kind of science that just doesn't look at genes at all, but just leaps to the conclusion that if differences persist after you control for zip code or something, that means it must be because of genetics. So recent studies have pointed to genes as the cause for higher rates of infant mortality, breast cancer, high blood pressure, asthma, at the same time that there is a less well-supported science, and it is also scientific research that shows that what is causing these health disparities are the unhealthy effects of everyday racial discrimination. And so race is a political category that does have staggering biological consequences, not because of differences at the genetic level, but because of the impact of social inequality on people's health. I think that also, if you were going to start with a plausible hypothesis about why Black people or Latinos or other groups of color in America have poorer health, you would wonder why a social grouping made up of people that have lots of different ancestry from around the world, why would that group have poorer health? Well, the most plausible explanation would be it's got to be because of social inequality. I mean, that if you weren't taught that genes explain everything, or that that race is divided by genes, that would be where you'd start from. You wouldn't start from genetics, because that doesn't make sense. So, but there is science, I think very exciting science, that is showing more and more the effects of experiencing racism, in addition to the effects of environmental toxins, the effects of just inadequate access to health care, and other kinds of disadvantages that people experience on the basis of race. What else is happening in this racial science? The pharmaceutical and biotech industries are exploiting race as a convenient but unscientific proxy for genetic difference to market new drugs. We're told that we are any day now going to have personalized medicine, medicine that will be tailored to our individual genotypes, or at least that we can choose a type of medicine that matches our genotype, that is shown genetically to work for us. That day hasn't happened yet, except in very limited cases. And so race increasingly is being used as a way of turning that promise, that vision of tomorrow's personalized medicine, into profits for today. Probably the most striking example of that was the Food and Drug Administration's approval of the first race-specific drug, a medication for heart therapy that was approved for self-identified African American or Black heart failure patients. Now, even though the newspapers and the FDA itself claimed that this was a step toward personalized medicine, the development of this drug had nothing to do with genetics. It didn't even have anything to do with Black people. It became a drug for Black people for commercial reasons, and there was absolutely no evidence at the time of the approval that the reason why it worked for Blacks had anything to do with genetic difference. And yet the FDA in its press release states that its approval was a step toward personalized medicine, and the head of the committee that recommended approval just point blank said, we're using race as a proxy for genetic difference. At the same time that we're seeing more and more interest in race-specific drugs for marketing reasons, all Americans are increasingly expected to become biocitizens, what I and others have called biocitizens, to assume full responsibility for their welfare through the consumption of gene-based goods and services. Instead of relying on universal health care for everybody, we should be using genetic testing, we're told, and gene-based products to be able to be healthier at the molecular level, and also to choose to have children who are healthier through gene testing. There's more. A popular ancestry testing industry gives customers the false hope that a cheek swab can trace their racial roots to 4 major population groups, or one company calls it the biogeographical component of race. And they're laughing in the audience, that's not me. Or another type of testing claims that the company can trace your ancestry to a specific African, Native American, or Jewish tribe. Now, by splitting customers' ancestry into racial percentages, you're 50% African, 25% European, 25% Native American, for example. Of course, if you go to another company, they'll tell you you're a different. It reinforces the myth that human beings were originally at some point divided into pure races, and you are now a combination of a percentage of these pure races that sometime in the past mixed together. But the concept of being 50% European, 50% African American, or African, I should say, and it's read as 50% white, 50% black, relies on a concept that there's a way to be 100% white. And in fact, that's what Henry Louis Gates told Stephen Colbert. You're the whitest person I've ever tested, because he came out 100% European. So it reinforces this view that when we talk about white people and Black people, Asian people, we're talking about a race that can be determined at the genetic level. It's just that some people are mixtures of these pure races. It also, I'm not going to go into it now. Maybe we can talk about it in the discussion afterward. But it also reinforces a view that our identity is rooted in our genes. And so even though I absolutely understand why many people get a lot of comfort and enlightenment from genetic testing that tells them where their ancestors are from, even though I don't think it really can do that, but people get a lot of support and reinforcement of their identity, as a Native American or an African American or a Jew. Many people have reported this, and I understand that, but I think it misplaces identity and political consciousness in genetics instead of in the solidarity we have in fighting against social injustice. I think that's where our identities should come from. And if you want to claim a country in Africa and claim solidarity with it, believe me, you don't have to take a genetic test to do that. You can travel there or learn about the country, or email, send donations, engage in financial transactions, other cultural transactions. I don't think that genetics should be the basis for our political solidarity. Okay, one more way in which the new racial science is being implemented in technology, and that is the huge buildup of DNA databanks that state and federal authorities are amassing across the country. They increasingly have spread out to more and more categories of people, including children, and including people who are only arrested for crimes, which means people that the police want to stop and arrest. That's all that's required in California, for example, and in other states, and all that's required by federal agents who detain people they suspect of being undocumented immigrants or people they suspect of committing crimes. And who are these increasingly innocent people who are made permanent suspects because their profile stays in the databank to be surveyed whenever a new crime scene sample is run through? They are disproportionately Black and Latinos because Blacks and Latinos are disproportionately picked up and arrested for immigration violations and crimes in this country, despite evidence that they are not more likely to commit these crimes, like marijuana possession in New York City, for example. Increasingly, I would argue that their whole communities are put under surveillance, because if you add to the power of law enforcement to test for DNA and store it based on arrest, you add to that familial tracing or family searches, where family members now are asked to submit DNA because of a partial match to someone who's already in the database. You are really spreading out this genetic surveillance to entire communities. And although it's true that DNA has helped to exonerate more than 200 wrongfully imprisoned individuals, who most of whom are Black people, there's no evidence that this massive collection of DNA from people who are only arrested or convicted of petty offenses is going to help to exonerate people or make us safer. And you have to ask, why are all those people falsely imprisoned in the first place? That same system that put them in prison is going to be handling this DNA. And so I haven't seen convincing evidence that this huge expansion of DNA collection that is primarily on the backs of people of color is worth the expanded surveillance, the laboratory errors and backlogs, and the reinforcement of racial stereotypes that are also being promoted by a new racial science that increasingly is looking at a genetic cause for criminality. So the system of mass imprisonment that we have in the United States and the expanding genetic surveillance that supports it exemplifies what I mentioned earlier about the escalating brutality against communities of color that I fear is obscured by a new biopolitics of race that makes race seem significant at the molecular level as it appears less significant in a supposedly post-racial society. And let me add one of the most frightening aspects of this new biopolitics, and that is that it's not just conservatives who espouse a colorblind ideology, the idea that there's no more racism in America, so we should be colorblind, except when it comes to medical research and research looking at to social inequality, and who also argue that we must give science a free pass because liberals are pro-science, conservatives are anti-science, and so if you criticize anything science is doing, you're not a true loyal liberal anymore. And I think that is an especially scary aspect of this new biopolitics. So let me close with what I hope is a more uplifting part of the book. I do get to some hopefully more inspiring aspects at the conclusion. So I thought I would just read a little bit from my conclusion of Fatal Invention that proposes an alternative vision. I'm just going to get a sip of water. Okay, so in the conclusion, I take up the question of, what are genetic scientists supposed to do if they can't use race? How do you do science without using biological race? But then I move on to asking about what these issues mean for the rest of us. So what does the path of common humanity mean for all of us? We should reject the notion of biological citizenship based on genetic ties and consumption of biotechnologies that allow us to manage our welfare individually at the molecular level. Instead, we should forge a notion of citizenship based on our common moral commitment to end racism and other forms of social inequality that recognize social change cannot be accomplished with a technological fix. It is the belief in the fundamental human equality that inspires many people to fight collectively against racism and its dehumanizing practices. Locating the causes of inequality in social rather than genetic structure is liberating, because it should be much easier to change society than to change genes. It is more enlightened to understand the potential for political alliances apart from biological distinctions than to believe we are inevitably divided and shackled by immutable differences programmed in our genes. Recognizing the relationship between neoliberalism, state authoritarianism, and the new biopolitics of race creates the potential for alliances among groups that see the dangerous potential in the escalating march from state support for public welfare toward market-based solutions and repression of people who are suffering most from this trend. Anti-racist, disability rights, and economic, gender, reproductive, and environmental justice movements all have a stake in fighting the emerging racial biopolitics. These potential coalitions provide hope for a broad-based social movement that rejects biological definitions of race and citizenship in favor of the radical restructuring of our society into one that respects the humanity of all people. Will Americans continue to believe the myth that human beings are naturally divided into races and look to genomic science and technology to deal with persistent social inequities? Or will they affirm our shared humanity by working to end the social injustices preserved by the political system of race? This is the most pivotal question facing the nation in the 21st century, because the answer will determine the basic nature of the relationship between citizens and the government and with each other. One path is already leading to aggressive state surveillance, extreme human deprivation, and unspeakable brutality against whole populations on the basis of race. By obscuring the coercive control over poor communities of color, the new racial biopolitics permits the growth of a state authoritarianism and a corporatized definition of citizenship that endangers the democratic freedoms of all Americans. We must choose the other path of common humanity and social change if we are to have any hope for a more free and just nation. Thank you. Discussion, comments, your experiences, what you think about all of this. So Marcy is going to help me. Yes, yeah. Okay.
I have a question. I'm Amina Mama from the University of California, Davis.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to ask about the extent to which you think that this kind of intellectual politics is a function of the division between the intellectual cultures, because all the progressive thoughts has come from arts, social science, humanities, where a lot of the debunking of race has happened. And here we're talking about another version of this so-called pure science. So my question is, are scientists deliberately doing and directing this kind of work, or is it an unconscious culture that they've imbibed in, along with being self-identifying as objective and neutral? So to what extent can we address it by trying to transform those intellectual cultures and the disciplinary silos that are part of this package that you've elucidated so brilliantly?
Yeah, thank you. So that's a really good question, because I think that there is this division that is emerging between the real science, which is genetics and genomics, and that science that if it even rises to the level of science, that is supposedly influenced by political ideology, anthropology, sociology, and the humanities, the arts. That you see more and more this pitting in newspaper articles, that talk about these new studies, and they will say, well, now sociologists have to, really rethink what they've been saying, because the true science, of genetics is exposing that sociologists don't know what they're talking about. Law professors, even less so. So I think there is definitely that, and you see it in funding. Who's getting the funding? What are the new centers going up that are really funded with tons of money? I've noticed that among my colleagues who are doing social science colleagues, many feel they must add a genetics component to their research, even research on child welfare policy. That I thought, these are two aspects of my work that I thought, wouldn't come together. Unfortunately, they're coming together in very pernicious ways. You've got to add a genetic component that looks at why children in foster care have such high rates of conduct disorder. So this move toward being legitimized by having a genetic component to your research. And I'm not trying to say that there isn't value in genetic research. I'm just saying that it shouldn't have authority over all other kinds of science, and it shouldn't be immune from scrutiny and criticism. Now, I do think that the question of why is this science emerging now? I think there are a number of forces that are fueling it. I mentioned the commercial aspect of it, that many scientists want to see a commercial product coming out of their research that can be licensed and produces fees. And so that is one influence. I'm not saying it influences everybody or it's a predominant influence, but it is an influence on some of this research. I think scientists who are doing genetic research have grown up with the same myths about race that everybody else has. And they put race into their research without thinking critically about what it means. And some people who've looked into this, like Dwayne Fulwiley, an anthropologist at Harvard, who asked the scientists, why are they doing this? What does it mean? And some of them can't define what race means, especially when it pertains to them. They're not sure what it means. And studies that have looked at the scientific literature have found very sloppy use of race. It may be undefined. It may be used one way as a genetic category in one part of the article, as a social category in another part of the article. Scientists who don't question how they can determine who's Hispanic for a medical study by last name, for example, or by the way the person looks, or by how they self-identify. If that's how they're determining race, they don't question, well, am I using a biological category or is this a social category? And then what are the implications of that? So I think, and then there's some, I think, who genuinely believe that that this is the best way to address health and other inequities, that genetics is the answer. And so I think that there are a variety of reasons, all of which I think can be engaged with. But you mentioned these silos. I think it's important for true interdisciplinary work to go on, and work that doesn't just pay lip service to looking at the social aspects of whatever the question is, and then ignore it, in the findings, or so emphasize the genetic conclusions that the social aspect disappears. But I think that projects engaging scientists who are doing this work are absolutely critical. Yeah.
Thank you very much for simplifying really complex intersects in the various disciplines, the sociopolitical, the scientific, etc. I'm sitting here, my take-home point is, okay, 50, 60 years ago, we had Jensen and the bell curve and IQ tests, and now we have DNA tests. So, but the broader question for me is, just as how we've had to push back intellectually on some of these junk science, as you will, what's happening with the real scientists, as you refer to them, in terms of debunking or pushing back, and are we just limited to the funders? I mean, what's in the discourse now in terms of, I mean, who's fighting this back intellectually in the literature?
Well, I think there are. I first have to say I'm not sure. I might have gotten lost in who are the real scientists and who are the false scientists. I do want to make the point that all of them are considered scientists, and the ones who are doing some of the people who are using race as a biological category or genetic category in their research are, some of the most esteemed scientists. So, and I make this point in the book that if you look at racial science over the generations. We now say, oh, that was pseudoscience, that was fake science. But at the time, it was considered mainstream, dominant, absolutely accurate science. So, which is why it is always important to scrutinize what scientists say and research. But I think that there is resistance to this coming from a number of avenues. The American Anthropological Association has issued a number of statements about race that refute the biological definition of race. As far as I know, they haven't changed their views on that. And I'm not sure about individual anthropologists, but I think the official statements of the American Anthropological Association. Same with, Troy Duster is here. I'm sure he would confirm that the American Sociological Association also has, had positions like that have not changed recently. There are a number of genomic scientists, evolutionary biologists, especially evolutionary biologists, who have argued, as I said, for decades, have not just argued, they've proven that race, that the idea of human races divided into, human beings divided into biological races contradicts what evolutionary science has discovered. And so at the Tarrytown meeting, for example, Joseph Graves, who's an evolutionary biologist, argued that the geneticists that are saying that race is a genetic category are like creationists. They're talking about a backward science. The evolutionary biologist, he says, they're not doing this. We know, he says, that it's ridiculous to say that the human species is divided into biological races. So even within the life sciences or biological sciences, there's dispute over this. And then, there's a whole field of science and technology studies also that is based on a critical scrutiny of science and looking at how science influences society and society influences science. So, and then there are the researchers who I mentioned, a growing group of them. They just don't get as much attention, but they are producing amazing and very enlightening studies that show, for example, how the stress of everyday racism affects people's health. And you put that in conjunction with the research that's showing that stress is so critical to people's health status. And it makes sense. It makes sense, of course, but it doesn't get as much attention or funding. And then, also, some of this, when I talk about the scientific research, some of this, we have known that the research on the environmental triggers of asthma, for example, has been around for a long time, but what are we going to do about it? At some point, you have to say, okay, I'm not saying the research shouldn't continue. I think it's important research. But in addition to the research, something has to be done to end the social determinants of poor health that have already been discovered. And I think, though, that when, if funders and policymakers and the general public believe that the reason for these health disparities come from genetic difference and not from what we know about the social determinants of health, then we stand less of a chance of ever having anything done about it. So those are just some of the points of resistance, I think, including organizations like Center for Genetics and Society and Generations Ahead that are working at to organize people at different levels to question and develop a different approach to genetic science.
Lines, beginning about the 1990s, required scientists, for good reasons, to keep records by race. Okay? They required it. Okay, so then now we have diabetes, asthma, cancer research going on. If you're in molecular genetics and you get a grant to do oncology research, and you find that there are differences between blacks and whites with prostate cancer, and you will, breast cancer and so on, you publish that because of NIH guidelines require you to say these are distinctions by race. So what we're seeing here is a kind of interesting, let me call it a sociology of science problem, where you needn't be mindful, purposeful, except you want a career. And that careerism takes you down the pathway of getting funding for asthma research, oncology, cancer research, diabetes of all things. I mean, in the last 20 years, diabetes has skyrocketed in this country. Gene pools don't change in 20 years, right? So you think people would say, as Dorothy said it, it's sort of illogical to conclude that you could get a big grant to study the genetics of diabetes. But that's where the money is. So if you're a young scientist and you want to study diabetes, you talk about the genetics of diabetes. Otherwise, it's a complicated issue about the big companies which produce all of these soft drinks and, how are you going to take them on? You can take on the molecular issue of diabetes with a sample of a few hundred people and conclude it must be genetic.
Right, well put, exactly. So it's not, it's government funding in addition to the corporate funding, and where you're going to get support for your research. And it's spreading, as I said, it's spreading beyond genetics into even the social sciences.
Sure. Hi, my name is Elisa Bieria. I'm with the Center for Race and Gender. I'm a longtime follower of your work. Thank you so much for your talk and your work. I'm wondering what you think about Professor Henry Louis Gates's project around getting black people and Stephen Colbert to learn about their DNA heritage.
Yeah. Well, Gates produced and was featured in several PBS specials, African American Lives 1 and 2, Finding Oprah's Roots, and then the one Faces of America, I think it was called, that included people who weren't black. And I thought that the part of the show that talked about what historical research dug up about their family, their ancestors, the remarkable accomplishments that many of the people with the African Americans who had achieved so much, given so much despite some of them being born in slavery, and same about some of the immigrant ancestors in the Faces of America. I thought that was all extremely inspiring. I mean, at points I was even moved to tears. It was so wonderful and enlightening and encouraging about what people of color and immigrants have accomplished despite all that was society set against them. Then he turned to the DNA testing, and since producing those shows, he's also added his name to a company that markets direct-to-consumer ancestry testing. And he also is promoting an educational program that is based on the idea that black children will learn science and history better if they have their DNA tested and analyzed. And this is a route toward increasing the interest of black children in science and history. So he's a big promoter of ancestry testing, both through his business, his shows, and this educational program. As I alluded to in my comments, I understand why some African Americans would find this testing very important to their identity because, as many have expressed, they feel that they have been cut off from their heritage by the slave trade, whereas many Americans can trace their ancestry using historical records and archives back many generations. African Americans, with very rare exceptions, cannot do that prior to the 1800s. And so it fills a gap for many people in their heritage, in their sense of identity as someone descended from Africans. And so again, I understand, I think, that sentiment. I just think it's misplaced because I don't think that our identity as black people is rooted in genetics. I think it's rooted in a solidarity that comes from resisting racial oppression and a love and affinity for other black people that's tied up with that as well. And so I really fear that this testing, especially in this period of all these other developments of racial science that I mentioned, and it is, I interviewed Rick Kittles, who also has a company, African Ancestry, for the book, and he said to me, well, this isn't racial science. This deconstructs race, because I'm showing people that there is a lot of genetic diversity in Africa. And I'm not just saying you're African like some of these companies do, you're black, and the people say, yeah, I knew that before I spent $600 on the test. I'm telling them something about the diversity of groups within Africa. And so I'm challenging racial science. But still, it is based on an idea that your identity is rooted in your genes. And there are many African Americans who have rejected a genetic identity. And I would say that the history of black people's identity in America is a history of rejecting a biological definition, the constraints of biology that historically has said your biology is inferior, and that's why you're a slave, and that's why you should not be a citizen of this country, and that's why you'll never be able to learn, and that's why you cannot participate fully in society. And blacks historically have resisted that biological definition of being black and have come together to fight racism for political reasons. I'm not saying that it has nothing to do with ancestry. I mean, if Marcy says, okay, I'm going to claim to be a black person, then, but who knows? I'm just picking you out. But, we think that it has to have something to do with ancestry. Like, you've got to have some ancestors that were in Africa to claim, a black identity. We could talk about that too, but I think that's generally how people think about a black identity. But that's sort of like an entree into what it means to be black. and what it means to feel solidarity among blackness. Now, also, it's just as importantly, I think, most African Americans have some European ancestry. And that is not considered for most, now I'm not saying everybody, because some people identify as biracial or multiracial, but for most who identify as black, they are downplaying that part of their genetic ancestry. And so, you know, I know just personally, I talk about in the book, personally, I don't find my identity in my genetics. I find it in a moral and political commitment to black people, which, as identifying as a black woman, I'm ignoring some of my genetic ancestry, which comes from Europe. And so, in fact, you know, at least half of it does. But that is not important to my political identity. And so I just think that it's misplacing where we should find our identity, and adds to this trend I write about of looking to biology as the source of our camaraderie, the source of our citizenship, the source of, you know, where we spend our money, you know, the source of so many things that should be rooted in a moral and political commitment. You know, it's hard to, it's more complicated than, you know, there's so many issues that go into that, and there are other groups, you know, Native Americans, Jews, other groups that have debates within their communities as well about the role of genetic testing. But that's what my position is. And, you know, we probably don't have time, but if I also talk about in the book just the scientific flaws in making a claim that you can tell somebody in 2011 where their ancestors, perhaps 300 years ago, came from in Africa, when problems with the claims, the kind of claims that are made, as if they're definitive and accurate designations of exactly what tribe your ancestors came from.
Hassan Dudar, Richmond Confidential. What role do you see the media has in vetting these issues, and what impact has it had on the public discourse? Do you feel there's some undue attention to either one of the sides?
Yes, I think you could write a book about that. I think that the media, especially certain journalists, not only pay more attention to discoveries that claim to show that race is found in the genes. You know, that's what gets on the front page. More of those studies are reported on, but also they make conclusions about the studies that aren't found in the studies. I mean, one example is I mentioned the gene clustering studies. That the one that was done by a group of mostly Stanford scientists, that found, you know, the 5 human groups that happened to map onto race. You know, so it's reported as they discovered race in, you know, in the human genome, and even though the study explicitly said we are not, you know, making any statement about race in this study, and also the reporting conveniently leaves out that they also found, you know, that you could divide human beings into 2 groups, into 6 groups, 7 groups, 8 groups, you know, up to 20 groups in this particular study. They leave all of that out. So they not only pay more attention to those studies, and also, you know, underlying that is that the studies that find that there is some race-based genetic difference are also more likely to get published. You know, all the studies that find there isn't any, they don't get, well, some do get published, but they may not get published because they haven't discovered anything, and then they're less likely also to be reported in the newspapers. But when you have, Nicholas Wade, for example, using terms like, an African gene, or the principal human races. I start the book with a quote from one of his articles. Yes, the principal human races presumably emerged as the populations of each continent responded to different evolutionary pressures. That's a 2009 article in the New York Times. So that kind of language that assumes that there are biological races that are naturally found in human beings, and that there are particular genes that are found only in particular races and that can identify those races. Both of those are just false. But when reporters use that kind of language, people read it. I've gotten responses to my book when I have given some radio interviews, and then there's comments. It's put online, and there are comments about it, and the comments are, well, but all these studies are coming out, and they haven't read the studies, but they've read the reporting about the studies, and you read the reporting about the studies, and you would believe that scientists have discovered race in the human genome, and they have discovered that the reason for higher rates of various diseases among blacks is because there is a black gene that causes disease. People believe this, and they think it's being confirmed by science, and that is reinforced by the way that some science journalists write about it. Not all. I mean, there are also, I don't want to make it sound it's only those studies, because there are other kinds of studies that discredit that view as well, but they just don't get as much attention. Oh, sure. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.